So you might have seen my previous video where I have this little trick using these zip ties to squeeze the saddles all together to help your guitar, your Strat, stay in tune. I have a problem with mine. The B and E strings are still not staying in tune, and I suspect that it's the same problem I had on my other Made in Mexico Strat, which is the block back here that the strings pass through. I believe these screws here have come loose, so in order to fix that, I'm going to have to take all these saddles off of the plate here and tighten these screws up and put the whole thing back together. But I decided this morning that I'm just going to remove the whole thing, pull all these saddles off, of course, take the trem block off of here, and I'm going to basically glue it with super glue onto this plate so that it can't come loose very easily. The trem block seems to want to come loose on you just playing. You don't even have to do any kind of whammy bar stuff. Just playing the thing will kind of cause this thing to loosen up. So I'm going to take this whole thing apart and glue it together and then put these screws in really tight, and hopefully that will fix my problem. So stay tuned. I'm going to take this thing apart. Oh, and real quick, a simple way to kind of get your intonation in the ballpark when you put it back together, is get some digital calipers and measure the distance between the back of the plate here and the edge of the saddle, and then write it down on a piece of paper what they are, and then you can put it back together, make it approximately the same distance, and then string it up, and then you can fine-tune your intonation from there. Alright, so here I've got all the screws out to hold the bridge onto the body, and it is now removed. And as you can see, the trem block here is very narrow. I'm not sure why it's designed this way. I don't have a problem with it personally, because there seems to be this camp that believes that you're supposed to have like all this mass on the bridge for great tone and all this baloney. You really want your bridge to be have the least amount of mass, or maybe not the least amount of mass, but you want it to be as you don't want it to suck the energy out of your strings. So the less mass you have, actually, the more sustain you're going to have if it's the right material. So I think they didn't do this so much as a cost-cutting measure like people would say. I think they did it because they wanted to make the bridge a little more resonant. Because, I mean, let's face it, this steel and whatever this casting is, it's not very good at conserving energy from the strings. That's what gives you a resonant guitar. If you look at the Parker Fly design, it's got a cast aluminum bridge. The whole guitar is about conserving energy from the strings, not having the material soak it up. So anyways, now I'm going to remove this block here. It doesn't seem to be loose, but with string tension on, I think it's just loose enough down here at the E and B string to cause it to go out of tune. Another thing I noticed is these screws that hold the bridge on to the body, some of these are tweaked. You can actually see they bend more to one side than the other, and that for sure will cause tuning problems also. So anyways, I'm going to now take the saddles off this thing, glue it on to the plate. So the next thing I've done is I've stuffed the holes here where the strings pass through and where the whammy bar goes into the block with some Q-tips so that glue can't run down inside of those. And then when I'm done, I can just poke these out. And same with where the whammy bar goes in, I'll just poke this out from the back side. So next thing to do is to stick this in the vise. Then we can apply some glue. Oh, and by the way, I've roughened up the surfaces that are going to be mating with some sandpaper to give it more grip for the glue. So we're going to put not a crazy amount of glue on here, but we're going to be somewhat generous with the glue. So this is basically cyanoacrylate glue, or more commonly known as super glue. I actually got this for Friendly Hobbies for an RC plane fix, but I found this stuff works good for all kinds of different purposes. Then we can carefully set this plate on top. That'll just stay there by gravity. Now I noticed one thing that might be a problem on these Made in Mexico narrow string space bridges is these screws that hold the block to the plate are pretty short. So I don't know, that could maybe be a factor as well as to why these tend to come loose, but we're just going to go ahead and put these screws in here. And then I'm just going to really torque them down. Those are as tight as I could possibly get them. So now I'm just going to let this super glue set up for a couple of hours, and I'm going to pull this all apart and start putting it back together. Just to show you, I have just a little bit seeping out the edges here, which to me tells me that was just enough glue to do the job and not too much. And so you can see my Q-tips sticking out. I'm just going to pull them out when this sets up. Or I could probably even do right now, but I think this will fix my tuning problems for the most part. The one thing I'm not sure about is these screws. Some of these have a definite slant towards one side, and I'm just not sure what I'm supposed to do about that. That definitely would affect your bridge position when you use your whammy bar, because it's going to tend to kind of end up in a different place every time. So the most important part is basically this flat area here where there's no threads, but how to make sure that that's nice and straight, I don't know. I suppose you could go get new screws, but I suspect that these things basically aren't very precisely manufactured no matter where you get them from. Which seems to point back to a thing that Scott Henderson said about his Strats. He actually enlarges these holes where the screws go through, and he says that that's a large part of why his Strat style guitars stay in tune so well. I might look at this and see if I can maybe at least smooth up these holes. They seem to be a bit rough, like they've just been punched with some kind of machine and then just left. And there are rough edges in here which, you know, can catch a little bit. So if you have one little rough piece catching on a screw times 6, that's potentially enough to just throw it out of tune just a little bit. So anyways, yeah, we'll just let this thing set up for a couple hours and then come back to it. So I decided I'm going to take a small, very small rat tail file, and I'm just going to file these holes just a little bit till I don't feel any rough edges anymore. Like this first hole I started on, I felt a lot of rough edges. Oh yeah, so this one's got a bunch too. So I think smoothing those out will definitely help with any kind of tuning problems as well. Yeah, all these feel very rough. Now you can imagine you got 60 screws and it's binding on every screw a little bit. That's going to contribute to unstable tuning as well. Yes, those all feel much better now. Yeah, those first three were pretty rough. Yeah, these first three were very rough. And that was from primarily my tuning problems seem to be the E and B, and then sometimes the G, but mostly the B string. The B string is constantly going out of tune on me lately. I know part of that could be old strings, but I really believe it's more to do with this bridge than anything else. Alright, I feel pretty good about that. That smoothed up things quite a bit. I still see one rough edge over here. Yeah. That's also a contributing factor for sure. So anyways, there you go. I'll get this thing put back together pretty soon here. But I think that this will stay in tune infinitely better now that I've done all this stuff. So I got the saddles all back on. I use my digital calipers to get the saddles in approximately the right position. So when I go to intonate the guitar, I should be pretty close. It's just some minor tweaking. And so now I guess I could stick this back on the guitar and string it up and see if this actually fixes my tuning problems. I suspect it should be a lot better, but the only way to find out is to put it on and play it. So I've been playing this guitar for a few days now, and my tuning problems seem to be just about a thing of the past. I mean, nothing more than like normal string stretching after new strings being put on. A couple other things I noticed about these vintage Strat bridges. The E and the B strings seem to be very sensitive to whatever angle is present on these saddles. I was initially thinking it's best to keep them level so that the string doesn't try to end up being in a different place all the time, but it seems like you kind of have to play around with the angle of this a little bit to help this stay as stable as possible. I discovered on a couple of these screws I had some gouges from where these burrs on the holes, I guess, were digging into the side of the screw, so I filed those down smooth. I think the fact that some of them were kind of more to one side or the other doesn't really matter. Once these things are in the body, it's kind of really not as significant as I was initially thinking. So the other things to check, of course, are that your strings aren't binding in the nut. I've already put graphite on these slots. They're not binding or anything. This string holder, I guess, sometimes can be a cause of friction that could cause the strings to bind, but I've already in the past have kind of smoothed the back side of this down as much as possible. I don't think that is a major issue, but you know, if you have all these things going on at the same time, like you have this binding a little bit on the string tree, strings binding in the nut a little bit, cause a little friction there, that can contribute to tuning instabilities. And then, you know, if your saddles are moving around, you know, that can cause these to be going out of tune, as well as the tilt of the saddles. As you can see here, I've got all the saddles cinched together with a zip tie. And the other thing that I was thinking about this morning is that, you know, I only have 3 springs on here, so I made sure that the strings are on the bottom 2 claws over here to counteract the tension of the E, B, and G string here, since these probably have I think more tension on them than these bigger strings. Those are all things you can look for and do to your Made in Mexico Strat with the vintage style bridge. This one happens to have the narrow spring spacing on it, and I mean, that's as good as it's going to get. It's staying in tune better than it was, so I'm happy about that. And you know, like I said, I've been playing it for a few days and it's been staying in tune very well. So other than just normal string stretch, these are new strings. If this helped you in any way, let me know in the comments, and give me a thumbs up if you like the video. I know it's a little long, but this is a complicated system. There's a lot of places where you can have things binding or shifting around.